Monroe Shelby had never once stayed until morning, not in 7 years of riding, and Susanna Bailey had made her peace with that long before she ever laid eyes on him. The town of Caldera Flats sat crouched at the foot of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains in the New Mexico Territory, the year being 1878, when the land was still raw and unfinished, when the law was a suggestion more than a certainty, and when a woman running a boarding house alone was considered either very brave or very foolish, depending on who you asked. Susanna Bailey was 26 years old, and she had heard both opinions more times than she cared to count. She had come to Caldera Flats with her husband Thomas 3 years prior, believing in the promise of cheap land and open sky, and Thomas had died of a fever in the summer of 1876, leaving her with the boarding house, a small herd of goats, a vegetable garden that barely cooperated, and a reputation as a widow who kept to herself and expected her boarders to do the same. She kept the rooms clean. She kept the meals hot. She kept her chin level and her feelings to herself, and the people of Caldera Flats respected her for it, even when they whispered that she was too young to be so alone and too proud to admit it. Monroe Shelby arrived on a Tuesday in late October, riding a buckskin horse the color of old honey, with a bedroll tied behind his saddle, and a rifle resting easy across his lap the way a man holds something he is completely accustomed to. He was 30 years old, and looked it in the way that men who spend their lives under open sky look their age, with weather-carved lines at the corners of his eyes and a jaw that had forgotten the luxury of regular shaving. He wore a dusty brown coat that had once been good quality and still retained a kind of dignity in its wear. His eyes were a particular shade of gray that changed with the light, and Susanna noticed this about him before she noticed much else, which unsettled her in a way. She filed away and did not examine too closely. He came to the boarding house because Frank Delgado at the livery stable told him it was the cleanest place in town, and because Monroe Shelby had been sleeping under the open sky for 3 weeks, and his back was announcing its objections with increasing conviction. He knocked at the door and held his hat in his hands when she answered, which was the first thing that separated him from most men who came to her door. "Mrs. Bailey," he said, because Frank had told him her name. "I am looking for a room if you have one available. I can pay 3 days in advance, and I keep quiet hours." She looked at him for a moment the way a woman looks at a man when she is deciding whether he is telling the truth about himself, which is a particular kind of looking that takes in more than the surface of a person. What she saw was a man who was tired in a deep way, not just the tiredness of travel but something older and more settled than that, the tiredness of a person who has been moving a long time and has stopped asking where they are going. $4 for the week, she said. Meals are included. I do not permit drinking in the rooms or loud company after 9 in the evening. The outhouse is behind the garden, and there is a bathing room off the kitchen that I keep heated on Tuesday and Saturday evenings. That suits me perfectly, he said. She showed him to the room at the back of the house, the one with the window that faced east toward the mountains, and he stood in the doorway a moment and looked at it with an expression she could not quite name, something between relief and grief, which was another thing she filed away without examining. "Supper is at 6, she said, and left him to it. There were 2 other boarders at the time. Clarence Webb, who was 63 and worked as the land office clerk, and had lived at Susanna's boarding house for 18 months, treating it with the comfortable familiarity of a man who had found his last good arrangement. And Della Moss, a schoolteacher of 32 who had come from Missouri, and possessed an absolutely inexhaustible curiosity about other people that she dressed up as friendly interest, and that Susanna found both endearing and occasionally exhausting. At supper that first evening, Della asked Monroe Shelby approximately 9 questions before the biscuits had finished cooling, and he answered each one with the careful patience of a man who understood that the asking was unavoidable but whose answers revealed almost nothing. He was passing through. He had come from Arizona Territory. He had some business to conduct in the area. He liked his coffee black. He had no family to speak of. He did not mind the cold. After supper, Monroe helped Susanna clear the table without being asked, which was something no boarder had ever done before, not even Clarence, who was genuinely a considerate man. He stacked the plates with the efficiency of someone who had done kitchen work and was not embarrassed by it, and when Susanna said, "You do not need to do that," he said, "I know," and kept doing it anyway, and that was that. He rode out each morning before the sun was fully up and came back each evening before dark, and after 3 days the pattern was as established as anything. Susanna did not ask what his business was because it was not her custom to pry, and because there was something about Monroe Shelby that made a person feel that prying would be unwelcome in a way that went beyond mere privacy. He was polite. He was easy enough at the supper table. He occasionally spoke to Clarence about the railroad and its effect on land prices, and he sometimes listened to Della talk about her students with an attention that seemed genuine rather than merely courteous. But he did not stay in the evenings. He ate supper, helped clear, sat for perhaps half an hour on the porch if the evening was mild, and then disappeared to his room. And in the morning, when Susanna came down to start breakfast, his horse was already gone from the small stable behind the house. She had not thought much about it those first few days, because she had enough to think about already. The trouble with the water rights had started in September, 2 months before Monroe Shelby arrived, when a man named Garland Prout had filed a claim at the land office that, according to Clarence Webb, who had been visibly troubled by the whole business, would effectively redirect the creek that fed Susanna's garden and the gardens of 4 other small landowners on the eastern edge of town. Garland Prout was not from Caldera Flats. He had arrived in August with money and 2 lawyers, and the kind of confidence that only comes from believing the outcome is already decided. He was buying up land and water rights with a systematic thoroughness that made people uneasy, but that nobody quite knew how to argue against in any legal sense. Clarence had told Susanna about the claim in the careful way he told her difficult things, sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee and choosing his words slowly. "It is not entirely illegal," he had said, "but it is not entirely right either. The prior appropriation doctrine is murky enough in this territory that a man with good lawyers can make a reasonable argument. What does that mean for my garden?" Susanna had asked, and Clarence had looked at his coffee for a long moment before saying, "If the claim stands and the creek is redirected, your water supply is significantly reduced. You could sink a well, but the cost of that is considerable." Susanna had thanked him for telling her and had not slept particularly well that night, running the numbers in her head and finding that they did not add up favorably no matter how she arranged them. The boarding house income was enough to sustain her, but only if she managed her expenses carefully, and the garden was a meaningful part of that management, providing vegetables she did not have to purchase through the summer and fall. She had written a letter to the Territorial Land Office in Santa Fe explaining her situation, and had received back a letter that was polite and lengthy, and essentially said that the matter was complicated and being reviewed. That had been 6 weeks ago. So when Monroe Shelby came back from one of his morning rides in that first week, and found her in the garden turning the autumn soil with more force than was strictly necessary, and paused his horse at the garden fence and asked if something was wrong, she told him about the water rights situation in a straightforward and unsentimental way, not because she wanted his help or expected it, but because it was easier than saying nothing and he had asked directly. He listened without interrupting, which she appreciated. He had removed his hat and was holding it resting on the saddle horn, and the morning light was doing complicated things to the gray of his eyes. "Prout," he said when she had finished. "Garland Prout. You know him." Something shifted in his expression, brief and controlled. "I know of him. He operated a similar scheme in the Pecos Valley last year. A family named Arroyo challenged the claim. They lost their water and eventually their land." Susanna stopped turning the soil and looked at him fully. "That is not encouraging information." "No," he agreed, but they did not have documentation of prior use. Do you? She thought about it. I have the deed to the property, which includes reference to the water access. And I have a letter from the previous owner describing the creek as part of the property's resources. That might be useful, he said, depending on how it is worded. He dismounted then, looped his horse's reins around the fence post, and came into the garden without being invited, which should have irritated her but somehow did not, perhaps because he moved with such a complete lack of presumption, as if he was entering the garden to look at the problem rather than to impose himself upon her space. He crouched at the edge of the creek where it ran along the eastern border of the property, and studied the way the water moved, the way the banks were shaped, the small stone and mud damwork that someone, probably Thomas, had built to direct the flow toward the garden beds. How long has this arrangement been here? He asked. The previous owner built it. We have maintained it, so at least 12 years, probably more. He stood up and looked toward where the creek ran north, toward the high ground where Prout apparently intended to build his diversion. You need someone who knows the water law in this territory, he said. There is a man in Santa Fe, an attorney named Whitfield. He has handled prior appropriation cases before and he is not easily intimidated. Santa Fe is a long way, she said, which was her way of saying she could not simply ride to Santa Fe and expect everything to wait. You could write to him, Monroe said. I could give you the information. She studied him. Why would you do that? He looked at her for a moment with those changeable gray eyes, and then he looked back at the creek. Because what Prout is doing is wrong, he said simply, and because I know what it costs to lose the thing that keeps you standing. There was something in the way he said it that made her understand the statement was not abstract, that he was speaking from a particular experience he was not going to elaborate on, and she respected that in the way she respected her own private territories. Thank you, she said. I would appreciate the information. That evening, he wrote out the attorney's name and address on a piece of her writing paper, in a careful and somewhat formal hand, and gave it to her at the supper table. Della was watching this exchange with the bright interest of a person witnessing something she intends to think about later, and Clarence was very carefully not watching it, which amounted to the same thing. Susanna wrote the letter to Whitfield the following morning before breakfast, making copies of her deed and the previous owner's letter to include with it, and rode to the post office herself to send it. The days settled into a rhythm after that. Monroe's business in the area, which she eventually learned from Della, who had asked him directly in her unstoppable way, was connected to the cattle trade. He was assessing grazing land on behalf of a rancher in Colorado Territory who was considering expanding his operation southward, which explained his daily rides and also explained why he was in no particular hurry. The work was observation and documentation, requiring no fixed deadline. He paid his rent on time. He kept quiet hours. He was unfailingly courteous to Della, and kind to Clarence in the uncomplicated way that some men are kind to older people without making a performance of it. And he kept a certain careful distance from Susanna that she told herself she preferred. That was the correct and appropriate distance between a landlady and her boarder. That was sensible and clear. She noticed things about him anyway, the way a person notices things they are not trying to notice. That he was up before anyone else each morning, and that he moved through the house in those early hours with a particular quietness, not the practiced stealth of someone trying not to be caught, but something more like a person deeply accustomed to solitude, who had learned to move through the world without leaving much impression on it. That he read in the evenings, actually read, with a worn book he carried in his saddlebag, and that when he was absorbed in it, his face lost its habitual guardedness and looked younger, more undefended. That he fed the leftover bread from supper to the goats without being asked, and seemed to genuinely enjoy the goats' company in a way that was completely at odds with his otherwise self-contained manner. She noticed also that he was handsome in a way she found inconvenient. It was not a showy handsomeness, nothing that announced itself, but rather the kind that accumulated quietly over repeated observations until it was simply an established fact she had to work around. The third week of his stay, there was a hard freeze that came down from the mountains 3 days earlier than anyone had expected it. Susanna was up before dawn, as was her habit, and she went out to the garden to cover what she could of the remaining vegetables, working quickly in the dark with burlap sacking she had ready for this purpose. The cold was significant, the kind that gets into your fingers before you have been outside 2 minutes, and she was working fast and not entirely efficiently, because her hands were already clumsy with the cold. Monroe appeared at the garden gate in his coat and boots, fully dressed though it could not have been past 4 in the morning, and without a word, he picked up a section of burlap and began covering the row of parsnips at the eastern end. They worked together in the dark without speaking, moving efficiently around each other in the narrow garden beds, and it was only when they had covered everything that could be covered that Susanna straightened up and blew on her fingers and allowed herself to feel how cold she was. "Come inside," she said, because it was the only reasonable thing to say. "I will put coffee on." They sat in the kitchen while the coffee heated, and the kitchen was warm with the lingering heat from the previous evening's cooking, and the dark was still absolute outside the windows. She wrapped her hands around her mug and felt the warmth work its way back into her fingers, and Monroe sat across from her at the kitchen table and held his own mug and looked at it. "You were awake," she said, not quite a question. "I usually am at that hour," he said. She thought about asking why but did not. Instead she said, "Did you grow up on a farm?" He looked up as if the question surprised him by being gentler than he had expected. "Ranch," he said. "West Texas. My father ran cattle." "You did not go back to it?" "No," he said, and then after a moment as if he was deciding something, "My father sold the ranch when I was 20, lost it to debt really though he always said sold. I had been away for 2 years by then working cattle drives up from Texas, and when I came back there was nothing to come back to." Susanna considered this. "And you have been moving since?" He looked at her steadily. "Something like that. Does it suit you?" she asked. "Moving?" He was quiet for a moment, and the question seemed to settle on him with more weight than she had intended. "It suited me better when I was younger," he said finally. "I am not sure it suits me now." She did not know what to do with that honesty, which was more than she had expected, and so she got up and refilled their coffee cups even though neither of them had finished, and she asked him about the cattle drives, and he told her about them in a measured way that was neither boastful nor falsely modest, just the plain account of a man describing work he knew well, and they talked until the sky outside began to lighten, at which point Monroe stood and said he should get his horse ready for the day's work. Susanna watched him go and then stood for a long moment in her kitchen with her coffee and felt something she had not felt in a long time, which was the specific and somewhat inconvenient awareness that she was not indifferent to a person. She told herself it did not matter. He was a boarder. He would leave when his work was done, which might be another week or 2. She had learned a long time ago, or she believed she had learned, that wanting things you could not hold was a worse kind of loneliness than having nothing to want. The reply from the attorney Whitfield arrived at the end of Monroe's 3rd week. It was a detailed and encouraging letter. Whitfield believed that Susanna's documentation of prior water use was sufficient to challenge Pruitt's claim, and that the specific language of her deed, which he quoted back to her in his careful legal prose, was particularly useful. He proposed to file an injunction to halt the diversion work until the matter could be properly adjudicated before the territorial court. His fee was $15, which was not a small amount but was manageable, and he would need the original documents rather than copies. Susanna brought the letter to Monroe that evening because she felt she owed him the information, given that he had been the one to suggest Whitfield in the first place. She found him on the porch in the late evening cool with his book, and she sat in the other chair and showed him the letter, and he read it carefully twice. "This is good," he said. "Whitfield knows what he is doing. The injunction is the right move. It buys time and puts Pruitt on the defensive. "I need to send the original documents to Santa Fe," she said. "I am somewhat nervous about that." "Take copies," he said. "File the copies with Clarence at the land office first so there is a local record. Then send the originals to Whitfield. That way you have documentation at both ends. That is a sensible precaution. Pruitt has lawyers who are looking for procedural weaknesses. Do not give them any." She looked at him in the yellow lamplight that came through the parlor window. He was speaking with a practical directness that she found tremendously reassuring, not because he was making promises he could not keep, but because he was helping her think clearly through something that had been making her anxious for weeks. "Monroe," she said, using his first name for the first time without quite noticing she had done it. "Why are you helping me with this?" He put the letter down on his knee and looked out at the dark street. A horse was moving somewhere at the far end of town, its hooves muffled by the dust. The mountains were invisible in the dark, but their presence was something you felt rather than saw, a weighted quality to the eastern horizon. "I told you before," he said. "What Pruitt is doing is wrong." "You told me that was the reason," she said quietly. "I am asking if it is the whole reason." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of a man choosing his words with care because the words matter. "No," he said. "It is not the whole reason." He did not say what the rest of the reason was, and she did not ask him to, and they sat on the porch in the cool November evening until the chill became too much and they went inside. And Susanna lay awake that night with a chest full of something warm and inconvenient that she did not try to name. The fourth week brought trouble of a different kind. Garland Pruitt apparently learned of Whitfield's involvement because he arrived at the land office on a Wednesday morning and had a loud conversation with Clarence Webb that Clarence relayed to Susanna that evening with visible agitation and 2 cups of coffee. Pruitt had been aggressive and unpleasant. He had implied that he could make the land office's renewal paperwork complicated if Clarence was found to be facilitating interference with his legal claim. Clarence was 63 and did not need complications with his position, and he was visibly shaken. "He is trying to intimidate everyone around me," Susanna said, understanding immediately what was happening. "He is," Clarence agreed. "It is the kind of pressure that works in places where people cannot afford to make enemies." Monroe had been listening from the other end of the table with the still attention he gave to things that mattered. "Did he make any direct threat against Mrs. Bailey?" "Not direct," Clarence said. "But the implication was there. He said something to the effect that obstinate property holders in this territory had a way of finding their circumstances becoming difficult." The words landed in the room with a weight that nobody ignored. Susanna kept her expression level, which required a certain effort. She was not afraid exactly, but she was aware, in the way that a person who has been managing alone for 2 years is always aware, of her vulnerability as a woman without a father or brother or husband to stand behind her. Monroe set down his fork and looked at Susanna directly. "He will not do anything to you directly," he said. "Men like Pruitt rely on intimidation to avoid the complications that actual action would bring. As long as Whitfield's injunction is moving forward, Pruitt is in a defensive position and he knows it." "You sound very certain," she said. "I am not certain," he said. "But I have dealt with men like him before, and I am not going anywhere for the foreseeable future." Della, who had been listening with enormous and barely contained attention, looked rapidly between Monroe and Susanna and said absolutely nothing, which was so unusual for her that Clarence noticed it and looked at her quizzically. Susanna met Monroe's eyes across the table. "Your survey work," she said. "How much longer does it require?" "As long as it takes," he said simply, which was not an answer about the survey work at all, and they both knew it. The injunction was filed in the 2nd week of November. Whitfield sent word that the territorial court had accepted it and that the diversion work was halted pending a hearing scheduled for February in Santa Fe. Pruitt's lawyers had protested loudly and without success, and Whitfield seemed professionally pleased about this in the careful way of an attorney who does not permit himself more than professional satisfaction. Susanna read the letter at the kitchen table and felt something relax in her chest that had been clenched for 2 months. She looked up to find Monroe in the kitchen doorway, returned from his morning ride, his coat carrying the cold air of the mountains with him. The injunction was accepted, she said. His face did something quiet and pleased. Good, he said. Thank you, she said. Truly. He came to the table and poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot on the stove, and he sat down across from her, which he did not usually do in the mornings, because he was usually in a hurry to go back out, and she thought that maybe the work was winding down and he would be leaving soon, and the thought arrived with a particular ache that she recognized as confirmation of something she had been trying not to confirm. "What will you do?" he said, "when the hearing comes in February?" "I will go to Santa Fe," she said. "Whitfield believes my presence will be useful. A widow with 12 years of documented water use is a better plaintiff than an absent one. That is a 4-day ride in February. I know that. You could take the stage from Cimarron. I know that too." She folded the letter carefully along its existing creases. "I have managed difficult arrangements before." He looked at her in that steady way that had stopped making her uncomfortable somewhere around the second week, that she had come to find, if she was honest with herself, reassuring. "I know you have," he said. "And then I could take you." The offer hung in the air. Susanna looked at him. "To Santa Fe," he said. "I have business in the territory that would take me that direction. It would make more sense than the stage in February cold." She thought about the propriety of it, and then thought that propriety was a luxury she could consider once the water rights were settled, and that in any case she was 26 years old and a widow and capable of making her own determinations about appropriate behavior. "We would need to take Clarence or Della," she said. Something in his expression suggested he found this restriction reasonable rather than insulting. "Of course," he said. "Then I will consider it," she said, which was as close to yes as she was prepared to go in that moment. The evenings began to lengthen in the way they do in November, coming earlier and more definitively, and Susanna found herself planning supper to be ready later so there would be more time for the table conversation that had become, she admitted privately, the best part of her day. Monroe talked more than he had in the beginning, or perhaps she simply understood better how to read the space between his sentences, how to ask the questions that opened rather than closed. He had a sharp and quiet intelligence and an unexpected dry humor that appeared occasionally like sun through clouds, and Della loved him for it with the uncomplicated affection she extended to anyone who made her laugh. One evening in mid-November, Della played the small upright piano that stood in the parlor, a relic of the previous owner of the house that Susanna had kept tuned, because she could not bear to let it fall silent. Della played well, with a light touch and a good ear, and she played old songs that everyone knew, church songs and dance tunes, and the sentimental ballads that were everywhere in those years, carried from Tennessee and Virginia and Kentucky in the memories of people who had left everything else behind. Clarence sang along to some of them in a wavering but earnest tenor, and Susanna hummed the ones she knew, and Monroe sat in the armchair by the fireplace with his arms crossed and listened, with an expression of such unguarded quiet pleasure that Susanna had to look away from him for a moment to compose herself. When Della played a particular waltz, one of those simple and aching melodies that seem to be constructed specifically to make people feel things they would rather not feel in public, Monroe looked across the room at Susanna where she sat on the settee and said, with such absolute lack of ceremony that she did not see it coming, "Will you dance?" Della's hands faltered briefly on the keys, and then continued with admirable composure. Clarence found something very interesting to look at in the fire. Susanna looked at Monroe for a moment and thought about saying that the parlor was too small, which it was, or that she was not much of a dancer, which was true, or that it was perhaps not quite proper, which she no longer particularly believed. "All right," she said. He stood and offered his hand with the natural ease of a man who was not performing a gesture but simply making one. And she took it, and they moved in the small space between the furniture with the careful attention of two people learning the particular mathematics of each other's bodies. And it was not elegant. They were too close to the settee and too far from the fireplace, and Susanna stepped on his boot once and apologized, and he said it was fine in a voice that did not suggest fine at all, because his voice had done something different, something lower, and she looked up at him. He was looking at her with an expression she could not misread even if she had wanted to, which she did not. Whatever careful distance he had been maintaining had shifted in this moment. Not dramatically, not with any declaration, just shifted, like the balance of weight between two people who have been standing too long on the same side of something. Della finished the waltz and immediately began playing something much more lively and wholly unsuitable for close dancing, which broke the moment without destroying it, and Susanna stepped back and smoothed her skirt, and Monroe released her hand with what seemed like some reluctance. "You are a reasonable dancer," he said. "You are tolerable yourself," she said, and went to help Clarence with the lamp wicks. That night she lay awake for a long time and did not pretend to herself that it was because she was thinking about water rights. The morning after the dancing, Monroe was gone when she came down to start breakfast, which was the usual pattern, but something felt different about the absence, a different quality to the silence he left behind, as if the house were aware that something had changed and was waiting to see what would be done about it. What was done about it in the event was nothing immediate and everything gradual. He brought her wildflowers from the high meadow on one of his rides, a small, unpretentious bunch of late-season asters that were practically the last flowers in the territory, and set them on the kitchen windowsill without commentary. She thanked him without making anything of it. He asked her opinion on a question of land valuation he was working through in his survey notes, and she gave it plainly, and he wrote it down, and she had the feeling that her opinion was genuinely useful to him rather than merely solicited. He walked with her to the post office one afternoon when she needed to send a letter, and they walked back along the longer way that went past the edge of the creek, and he told her about a morning he had seen a coyote standing in the middle of the main street of a ghost town in Arizona territory, looking around as if taking inventory, and the way he told it was so precisely observed and quietly funny that she laughed out loud. And the sound of her own laughter surprised her slightly, because it had been a while since she had made that sound without effort. One afternoon in the last week of November, Susanna was in the stable behind the house checking on the goats, one of whom had developed a small limping issue she was monitoring with concern, when Monroe came in from his ride and unsaddled his horse in the same space. The stable was small and they moved around each other comfortably, with the ease that comes from shared routine, and he checked on the limping goat with the same serious attention he gave to horses, crouching down and examining the hoof with careful fingers. "Stone bruise," he said. "She needs to be kept off the rocky ground for a few days. If you have some of the comfrey growing in your garden, a poultice on the hoof twice a day will help." "I do have comfrey," she said. "I did not know it worked for that. My mother used it on horses," he said. "Goats have similar constitutions in some ways." She looked at him crouched next to the goat in the dim stable light, and something about the complete naturalness of him in this moment, this capable, uncomplicated helpfulness, the way he was simply present in her life as if he had always been meant to be there, made her feel something so acute and clear that it frightened her a little. "Monroe," she said. He looked up. "How much longer do you have with your survey work?" She asked it directly because she was a direct person and because she was tired of working around the question. He straightened up slowly. "I finished the main documentation last week," he said. She had known it was coming and it still landed strangely. "And when will you go?" He looked at her steadily. The goat pushed her nose against his knee and he put a hand on her back without looking at her. "I had thought," he said slowly, "that I might stay through the winter, if the arrangement suits." The words were careful. She understood they were doing more work than their surface suggested. "The arrangement suits," she said, equally carefully. He nodded, and the nod contained a universe of things neither of them had said yet. And then he picked up his saddle and went to hang it on its peg, and Susanna applied the comfrey poultice to the goat's hoof with hands that were not entirely steady. December arrived with the particular cold of the high desert, a clean, dry cold that was different from the wet cold of the east and that Susanna had come to prefer. Snow fell in the mountains and occasionally dusted the town, and the boarding house was warm and lit with lamplight and smelled of pine wood and the good food she cooked. And if Susanna Bailey had permitted herself to think of the house as full in any emotional sense, which she did not quite permit herself yet, she would have admitted it was fuller than it had been in a long time. Monroe had settled into the pattern of the house with the unconscious ease of someone finding a frequency they had forgotten they could tune into. He repaired the loose hinge on the stable door without being asked, and did it so neatly that she only noticed it was done because the door stopped squeaking. He chopped extra firewood on the days when snow threatened and stacked it against the side of the house in a way that kept it dry. He read to Clarence in the evenings, sometimes because Clarence's eyes had been giving him trouble in the cold, and he did it without ceremony, just picking up whatever Clarence had been reading and continuing from where the old man had left off. And Clarence had told Susanna privately that Monroe Shelby was the most quietly decent man he had met in 30 years of dealing with the public, which from Clarence was the highest possible praise. Della told Susanna at the first opportunity she had with her alone, which was a Sunday morning when Monroe and Clarence had both walked to the other end of town, that she thought Monroe Shelby was in love with Susanna and had been since approximately the end of the first week, and that Susanna was quite clearly in love with him, and the only question was which of them was going to do something about it. "Della," Susanna said. "I am right and you know I am right," Della said. "You are frequently right about other people's feelings, and considerably less perceptive about the complications involved." "The only complication," Della said with the confidence of a woman who has thought about someone else's problem more thoroughly than any other project she has undertaken, "is that he is afraid you will not want him to stay, and you are afraid he is going to leave regardless of what you want, and those two fears are perfectly calibrated to prevent either of you from saying anything." Susanna looked at her friend for a long moment. "That is," she said reluctantly, "a fairly accurate analysis." "Then one of you has to say something," Della said. "And it probably has to be you, because he is a man who has been moving his whole life, and he will not let himself believe he is allowed to stop unless someone tells him he is." That conversation stayed with Susanna for several days. She turned it over in her mind while she made breakfast, and while she fed the goats, and while she sat at the kitchen table with her account books in the evenings. She thought about what it would mean to say something, what she would say, what she hoped he would say in return, and what she would do if she had read it all wrong and he was simply being kind. And then she thought about what Della had said, that he would not believe he was allowed to stop unless someone told him he was, and she thought about that particular quality of exhaustion she had noticed in him the very first moment she had opened the door to him, that deep tiredness of a man who had been moving a long time, and she thought that maybe the bravest thing a person can do is tell the truth when the truth is that they want something they are afraid they cannot have. On a Friday evening in the middle of December, the other boarders had gone to bed early, Della with a slight cold and Clarence with his customary early retirement, and Susanna and Monroe were alone in the kitchen where the stove was warm and the lamp was lit and the winter dark pressed at the windows. She was making a list of supplies she needed to order for the holiday month, and he was reading, and the comfortable silence between them had become so natural that she sometimes forgot, for stretches of an hour, that they were not a thing she had told herself they were not. She put down her pen and said, "Can I ask you something difficult?" He lowered his book and looked at her with those steady gray eyes. "Yes," he said. "When you imagine a year from now," she said, "where are you?" He was quiet for a long time, Not the quiet of someone considering an evasion, but the quiet of someone being genuinely honest with themselves for possibly the first time in a while. "Here," he said. The word was so simple and so complete that for a moment she could not respond to it. "Monroe," she said. "I know I have no claim on that," he said, before she could continue. "I know that I am a man who has made a habit of leaving, and that is not a recommendation for anything. But when I try to imagine somewhere I would rather be than here, in this house, with you, I cannot produce it, and I have been trying." Susanna looked at him across the kitchen table with the lamp between them and felt something that had been braced for a long time begin to release. "I would not want you to stay because you could not imagine anywhere else," she said quietly. "I would want you to stay because you wanted to be here." "Those are the same thing," he said. "For me they are exactly the same thing." She reached across the table and put her hand over his where it rested beside his book, and his hand turned under hers and held it. Not a dramatic gesture, not a performance, just the simple holding of her hand by a man who had been a long time without anything to hold. And she sat there in her warm kitchen in the dark December evening, and was not alone in the way she had been alone for 2 years, and neither of them needed to say anything more that night. The weeks that followed were different in quality from the weeks before, though outwardly almost nothing changed. They were still a landlady and her boarder. He still rode out in the mornings and came back in the evenings. They still sat to supper with Clarence and Della and talked about ordinary things. But there was something between them now that had not been named in public and did not need to be, a mutual understanding that had the solidity of something decided, even though nothing had been formally decided at all. He held doors for her in a way that was different from before. She saved the best cut of meat for his plate in a way she had not been doing consciously, but that Della noticed, and said nothing about except with her eyes. He sat closer to her on the porch in the evenings, not improprietously close, but the distance between them had changed, contracted from the distance of courteous strangers to the distance of people who have acknowledged something to each other. Christmas came to Caldera Flats with a spare and windswept beauty. The townspeople gathered for the church service, and afterward there was a gathering at the community hall where someone had rigged pine boughs along the rafters, and someone else had brought a fiddle player from the neighboring ranch. And there was dancing of the energetic social kind that required no particular partner arrangement. Susanna wore the dark blue dress that she kept for occasions and pinned her hair up, and when Monroe saw her come down the stairs in the blue dress, he went very still for a moment in a way that told her everything she needed to know without his saying a word. He wore the good coat that she had noticed in his room's wardrobe and had not seen him wear before, and he had shaved more carefully than usual, and he looked so thoroughly and specifically handsome that she had to concentrate on her composure. They walked to the hall with Clarence and Della, and the evening was cold and bright with a half-moon on the snow, and their breath made clouds in the air, and Monroe walked beside Susanna close enough that their arms brushed occasionally with the contact of wool coats and gloved hands, and she thought she might burst with the simple happiness of being exactly where she was with exactly this person. At the hall, the fiddle player was already into his second set, and people were dancing the lively reels and quadrilles that were the staple of such evenings. Clarence was greeted by half a dozen people he knew from the land office, and was immediately absorbed into a conversation about the railroad. Della found the schoolteacher from the other side of town, and began a vigorous comparison of their students' holiday compositions. Monroe and Susanna stood together near the edge of the dancing and watched the whirl of it, and he said, "Will you dance?" with the same casual directness he had used the first time, as if the first time had not altered everything between them. "I thought you would never ask," she said, and he laughed, which was a sound she had come to love specifically, and they joined the set. They danced 3 dances together, which was 3 more than perfect propriety might have suggested, and after the third one the fiddle player played something slow, and the crowd thinned somewhat as couples stepped off the floor, and Monroe turned to her in the space between songs and said, in a voice that was only for her, "I need to tell you something." "Tell me," she said. I left a good deal out when you asked me about my history, he said. I want you to know the parts I left out. She waited. I was engaged to be married, he said. When I was 24, a woman in Colorado named Margaret, she died of cholera 6 months before the wedding. And after that I found it easier to keep moving than to stop anywhere long enough to feel how much I had lost. So I have been moving for 6 years, and I have been careful not to care too much about anything that required me to stay. He said it plainly, without asking for sympathy, just setting it down between them as a fact she was entitled to have. I am sorry about Margaret, Susanna said. I am, he said. She was a good woman. But I am telling you because I want you to understand why staying is not something I am doing lightly. I am not telling you I am over the grief of losing her, because some kinds of loss do not disappear. They just stop being the loudest thing. I am telling you that you are the first person in 6 years who has made me want something again, and I think that means something. Susanna looked at him in the warm light of the community hall with the fiddle starting up again, and the snow outside on the Christmas streets of Caldera Flats. Thomas died 2 years ago, she said, and I have been keeping myself very busy ever since and calling it living, and mostly it has been enough. And then you arrived, and I realized how quiet I had let everything become. She paused. I am not interested in careful, she said. I have been careful for 2 years, and it has served its purpose. I think what I am interested in is something that does not feel like management. I think, Monroe said, that is probably what I am interested in too. The fiddle began a slow waltz, the same kind they had danced in the parlor, and Monroe held out his hand and Susanna took it. And this time they danced without thinking about the furniture or the steps or the propriety of anything. They just moved together in the center of the room with the pine boughs overhead, and the snow outside and the fiddle threading through the winter air. And it was the best thing she had felt in longer than she wanted to admit. January was cold and productive in a quiet way. Monroe had formally extended his stay through February at minimum, citing the court date in Santa Fe as a reasonable practical justification that neither of them believed was actually the main reason. He had written to the Colorado rancher he was surveying for and sent his completed reports, and had received back a letter thanking him for his work and inquiring whether he was available for a second survey in the spring. He showed Susanna the letter over breakfast one morning and said, I have not decided whether to accept. What are the alternatives? She asked. He looked at her steadily. I have been considering whether there might be land in this territory worth looking at for myself. My own purposes. Susanna set down her coffee cup. This was the most direct he had been, and she was a woman who appreciated directness more than almost any other quality. For yourself, she repeated. I have been saving for 7 years, he said. Longer than was strictly necessary to save for a long trip. I think I was saving without knowing what for. I believe I may have an idea now. Her heart was doing something considerable in her chest. If you were looking at land in this territory, she said carefully, what would you be looking for? Something with water access, he said. Good grazing, near enough to a town to be practical, far enough to have quiet. That describes roughly a dozen parcels within 15 miles of here, she said, keeping her voice level with some effort. I know, he said. Clarence has been very helpful in that area. She realized then that Monroe had apparently been consulting with Clarence about local land availability with a degree of intention that made her feel slightly dizzy in a way she found she did not mind at all. Monroe, she said. Susanna, he said. Are you working towards something in particular? She asked it with her eyes on his and her voice even and her hands folded on the table in front of her. I am, he said. I am working toward asking whether you would consider being courted by a man who has been a fool about his own life for most of his adult years, but who is very certain of his feelings in the present. The formality of this was so unexpected, and so careful and so completely at odds with his usual economy of words that she had to press her lips together for a moment. I would consider it, she said. I am considering it. Good, he said, and picked up his coffee cup, and she laughed. and he smiled with his eyes in the way he had. And Della, who had appeared in the kitchen doorway at an entirely inopportune moment for her own breakfast, took one look at both of them and went immediately back upstairs, and could be heard making a noise of delight from behind her closed door that was audible throughout the house. The months that followed were happy in a particular way that is difficult to describe without sounding either naive or sentimental, and Susanna Bailey had never been either, so she would have described it as practical and warm and frequently surprising and better than she had planned for. Monroe courted her with the same deliberate care he brought to everything, which meant he was thoughtful and consistent, and occasionally caught her completely off guard. He brought her books from the small lending library that operated out of the general store, choosing ones he thought she would like, which she always did. He taught her to read the mountain weather in the cloud formations over the peaks, which was genuinely useful knowledge. He asked her opinion on things, and listened to the answers with the fullness of his attention. He told her more of his history in pieces, as trust permits such telling, and she told him hers in the same way, and the piecemeal accumulation of a shared understanding of each other was one of the most intimate processes she had ever participated in. He also kissed her for the first time in mid-January on the back porch in the cold morning air when she came out to look at a hawk circling over the stable, and found him already standing there watching it. And he turned when she came out and looked at her for one moment, and then kissed her with the straightforward conviction of a man who has decided something and is done deliberating. And it was warm despite the cold air, and it tasted like coffee, and it lasted long enough to matter. When he stepped back, he looked at her with his hands still on her shoulders and said, "I have been wanting to do that for a considerable time." "I know," she said. "I have been aware." "Why did you not say something?" he asked. "I was waiting to see if you were going to," she said. He shook his head slowly. "We have wasted a great deal of time," he said, but he was smiling. "Not wasted," she said. "Taken carefully." February arrived, and with it the time to travel to Santa Fe for the water rights hearing. Monroe and Clarence went with Susanna, Della managing the boarding house in her absence with the organized efficiency that surprised people who thought of her as merely charming. They took the stage from Cimarron. 4 days of travel in the cold with overnight stops at stage stations that ranged from adequate to barely adequate. And Susanna and Monroe sat beside each other for 4 days in the stage and talked and were quiet and watched the winter landscape move past the windows. And by the time they arrived in Santa Fe, something that had been an almost thing had become, in the easy way of constant proximity, simply a thing. Whitfield was a lean, precise man in his 40s, who greeted them at his office with the brisk warmth of a professional who was confident in his preparation. He reviewed the case with them the evening before the hearing, asking Susanna a series of sharp questions about the history of the water access and her own use of it, and she answered each one cleanly and completely. The hearing itself was 3 hours long and conducted in a Santa Fe courthouse that was trying to be grand on a limited budget, before a judge named Arredondo who had a reputation for taking prior use claims seriously. Pruitt's lawyers were good, expensive, and practiced, and they argued the technical provisions of the water law with precision. Whitfield was better. He laid out a 12-year history of documented water use with the deed provisions and the previous owner's letter, and 2 additional supporting affidavits he had gathered from neighboring properties. And he did it with a clarity that made the opposing argument seem slippery by contrast. Judge Arredondo dismissed Pruitt's claim and confirmed Susanna's prior rights to the water, in a ruling that Whitfield described afterward as cleaner than he had hoped for. Pruitt's lawyers sat in their chairs looking at each other with the expressions of men who had taken their client's money and run out of things to do with it. Susanna sat very still in her chair for a moment after the ruling, breathing. Then she felt Monroe's hand cover hers under the edge of the table, and she held on to it. "You did it," he said quietly. "Whitfield did it," she said. "You started it," he said. "You kept it going. Do not give away the parts that belong to you." She looked at him sideways. When did you become someone who gives advice about giving away the parts that belong to you? It is relatively recent, he said. She squeezed his hand, and then they stood and went to thank Whitfield. And afterward they walked out into the cold Santa Fe afternoon with Clarence, who was quietly jubilant, and expressed it by buying everyone coffee at the hotel restaurant. And Susanna felt so thoroughly and completely relieved and grateful and happy that she had to excuse herself for 5 minutes and stand in the hotel washroom and collect herself. They were in Santa Fe for 2 additional days before the stage return. Monroe took her to the cathedral, which was the oldest church she had ever stood inside, with thick adobe walls and a silence that felt like it had accumulated over centuries, and they stood together in that silence. And she felt something that was not quite religious but was adjacent to it, the feeling of being in a place where time had agreed to mean something. On the last evening before the stage, they walked in the central plaza at dusk when the cold had the blue quality of high desert winter and the lanterns were being lit around the square, and Monroe stopped walking and turned to her and said, "I have been thinking about land." "You mentioned," she said, "specifically about a parcel about 8 miles east of Caldera Flats that Clarence tells me is available. It has water, good grazing, an existing structure that needs work." Her heart was doing it again, that considerable thing. "Monroe, I have enough saved to buy it and have some left for improvements," he said. "I could run a small cattle operation, nothing grand but sustainable." He paused. "I am also aware that I am telling you this as if it is a land investment conversation, and it is not." "What kind of conversation is it?" she asked. He looked at her in the blue dusk with the lanterns coming on around them and said, "I would like to know if you would marry me." I am asking imperfectly because I have not practiced this and I am somewhat out of my depth, and I understand if the timing seems rushed, though I note that it has been 4 months, which is not strictly rushed. 4 months, she said. And 3 weeks, he said. She looked at him for a long moment, at this man who had ridden into her life on a honey-colored horse with his quiet eyes and his deep tiredness and his patient decency and his 6 years of careful distance from anything that might matter. And she thought about who she had been when he arrived, that contained and well-organized and thoroughly lonely version of herself, and who she was now, and the difference was not complicated to identify. "Yes," she said. The word was so simple that he appeared to need a moment to be sure he had heard it. "Yes," he said. "Yes," she said again and laughed. He took her face in his hands and kissed her in the Santa Fe Plaza with the cold air around them, and the lanterns lit and Clarence watching from a comfortable distance, with the expression of a man who has waited 3 months for something he saw coming from the first week, and has the patience for it because he is 63 and knows that good things take the time they take, and somewhere behind them in the direction of the hotel, they would later learn. Della Moss had spotted them from the window and made the same sound she had made at the kitchen door 3 months ago, but louder. They married in March, in the little church at Caldera Flats, with a minister who had known Susanna since she arrived in town, and who conducted the ceremony with a warmth that suggested he too had been waiting for this. Clarence gave Susanna away with the careful dignity of a man honored by the role. Della stood beside Susanna in a pale green dress and spent most of the ceremony trying very hard not to cry and failing. Monroe stood at the front of the church in his good coat with his hat off, and his face so open and so lacking in the guardedness she had first seen in him that he looked like a different man, or rather like the man underneath the one she had first met, the one he had been before 6 years of roads and grief had taught him to hold himself back. He said his vows in a level and direct voice that did not shake, and that was not performative. He meant every word. She could hear that he meant every word, and it was the most honest thing she had ever witnessed. Susanna said her own vows and felt them settle into her like truth settling, like a piece of herself that had been at an angle for 2 years returning to its correct position. She did not cry because that was not her way, but she held his hands during the vows with a grip that communicated what her composed expression did not. The reception was at the community hall with the same fiddle player who had played at Christmas, and the same pine beams though without the holiday decorations. And the whole of Caldera Flats seemed to turn out with a warmth that suggested the town had been rooting for this outcome longer than the couple involved had been aware. There was food and dancing and a great deal of noise, and Monroe danced with Susanna 3 times and with Della once at her pointed request, and with the elderly Mrs. Gutierrez from the south end of town, because she asked him, and he was not going to refuse a 70-year-old woman a dance at a wedding reception. Monroe bought the parcel 8 miles east of town 2 weeks after the wedding. He and Susanna rode out to see it together on a clear April morning when the mountains were still capped with snow, but the valley floor was showing green, and they stood in front of the existing structure, which was a solidly built but rough adobe house with 2 rooms and a wood stove and a porch that faced west toward the mountains. And they walked the land and found the water and identified where a proper barn should go. And Susanna stood in the middle of the field that would be the pasture, and turned slowly in a full circle with the spring wind in her hair, and thought that she had not known, when she came to this territory with Thomas, that this specific view would eventually feel like hers. "What are you thinking?" Monroe asked, standing a few yards away watching her. "That it is very good land," she said. "It is," he agreed. "And that I am glad you found it," she said. "I am glad about a great many things," he said. He came to stand beside her and they looked at the mountains together. "I am going to need to hire some help to get the barn built before winter," he said. "I know 2 brothers at the south end of town who do good construction work," she said. "The Vargas brothers. They built Clarence's fence last fall. I will talk to them," he said. "Also," she said, "I have been thinking about the boarding house." "What about it?" "I would like to keep running it," she said. "Clarence and Della are there. It is a good income and I am good at it, but I would need to hire someone to help manage the kitchen days when I am out here." "Of course," he said immediately, as if there had never been any question. She looked at him. "You are not going to say anything about how the wife should be at home. You have been managing that house and everything in it for 3 years," he said. "I would be a considerable fool to suggest you stop doing something you do better than anyone else I know." "Good," she said, "because I was not actually asking." He laughed, and she leaned against his arm, and the spring wind moved through the field around them, and the afternoon was very good. The boarding house continued to prosper. Susanna hired a capable woman named Rosa Estrada to help in the kitchen on the days she was at the ranch, and Rosa proved to be a genuinely gifted cook in a way that slightly alarmed Susanna the first time she tasted her tortillas, and then stopped alarming her when she recognized that 2 good cooks was better than 1. Clarence and Della remained in their rooms, and the house continued to fill with the particular warmth that comes from a household being genuinely well run and genuinely cared for. Monroe built the barn with the Vargas brothers through the spring, working alongside them with the competence of a man who had done physical labor his whole life and was not too proud to take direction when the other person knew better. The barn was finished by July, solid and true, and Monroe brought his first small cattle purchase in August, 12 head of mixed breed stock from a rancher going out of business in the valley to the south. And Susanna came out on a Saturday morning to see them standing in the pasture, these 12 cows in the green field with the mountains behind them, and she stood at the fence and felt something she recognized as the beginning of a thing, which is a different feeling from having a thing and considerably more exciting. "What do you think?" Monroe asked, standing beside her. "I think 12 looks like a beginning," she said. "It is," he said. "Give it 3 years." By autumn, the ranch had taken on the quality of something real, not just promising but actual, with the particular smell and sound and feel of a working place. The cattle moving in the pasture, the horse in the new stable, the firewood stacking up along the side of the house, the garden Susanna had planted against the south wall of the house putting up its last autumn runners. They had fixed the existing adobe house considerably over the summer, adding a proper kitchen window and new shutters and a wooden floor over the packed earth of the main room, and it felt lived in and warm and exactly suited to them. One evening in October, a year after Monroe had first ridden into Caldera Flats on his buckskin horse, Susanna was in the kitchen of the ranch house making coffee when she heard him come in from checking on the cattle, heard him hang up his coat on the peg by the door, heard the particular sound of his boots on the new wood floor that she had already learned to distinguish from every other sound the house made. She turned and he came into the kitchen and she said, without any preamble, "I am going to have a baby." Monroe Shelby, who had ridden 3,000 miles of open country and faced down bad winters and difficult men, and the long grief of his 20s without showing much in his face, stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at his wife with an expression of such complete and undisguised joy that she had to press her lips together hard to keep from crying, which she did not do in general. He crossed the kitchen and took her face in his hands the way he had in the Santa Fe Plaza and said, "Are you well?" Which was the first thing he said. "I am very well," she said. "When?" "April," she said. "I believe April." He pulled her into his arms and held her with such a complete and careful tenderness that she felt it everywhere. And she stood in her kitchen in the October evening with her husband's arms around her, and the coffee heating on the stove, and the cattle in the field outside, and the mountains dark against the sky, and thought that she had been right not to give up on wanting things, that Della had been right that the only complication was fear, and that Monroe Shelby had been right when he said he had been wasting his life on movement for a long time and did not intend to keep doing it. "A baby," he said quietly into her hair. "A baby," she agreed. The winter was a good one, in the particular way that winters are good when you have somewhere warm to be and a reason to be there. Monroe continued to work the ranch through the cold months, expanding the herd gradually when opportunities presented themselves, and he was good at it in the patient way of a man who has spent years learning the rhythms of cattle and land, and knows that urgency is the enemy of good ranching. Susanna continued the boarding house 3 days a week and spent the other days at the ranch, and her pregnancy progressed with the straightforward good health of a woman who does not coddle herself, which the local physician, Dr. Reyes, found refreshing. Clarence came to dinner at the ranch on Sundays whenever the road allowed, becoming a fixture at their table with the easy comfort of an honorary uncle. Della came as well and spent her Sunday afternoons sitting with Susanna in the kitchen or on the porch depending on the weather, talking about the children at her school and the books she was reading, and occasionally, with increasing frequency, about a man named James Aldridge who ran the general store and who had begun finding reasons to be in the schoolteacher's vicinity with the unmistakable dedication of a person who has found someone they would like to be near. "He brought me a catalog from St. Louis," Della told Susanna in February with the expression of someone trying to be analytical about something that is making her unreasonably happy. "For books, he ordered 3 volumes I mentioned I wanted." "That is," Susanna said carefully, "a fairly specific gesture." "It is somewhat specific, yes," Della said. "Della," Susanna said. "I am well aware," Della said. By March, they were being properly courted by each other's company in the open and transparent way that made Clarence nod approvingly when he saw them at the store on his Saturday errands. April arrived, and with it the baby, on a clear morning when the fruit trees Monroe had planted against the south wall of the ranch house were just beginning to show their first white blossoms. A boy, strong and very loud from the first minutes in a way that made Dr. Reyes declare him exceptionally healthy and made Monroe laugh in the doorway of the bedroom, with the helpless particular laugh of a person who has been given something so large they do not know how to hold it. They named him Samuel, which was Monroe's father's name before everything had gone wrong with the ranch in Texas, and the naming of the child with that name seemed to Monroe to be a way of taking something that had hurt and making it into something that would grow forward instead. Susanna understood this without needing it explained. Samuel Monroe Shelby was a robust and energetic child who appeared to have inherited his father's gray eyes and his mother's determination, and who by the time he was 6 months old had established himself as an absolute favorite of both Clarence and Della, who competed mildly and without acknowledgement of the competition to be the one he smiled at most. Della and James Aldridge married in the summer, a small and happy ceremony, and Della moved from the boarding house to the rooms above the general store that James had prepared for her with the thorough care of a man who had been thinking about this for a long time. Susanna felt her absence in the house as a genuine loss, and also felt, without contradiction, completely glad for her friend. Clarence continued on at the boarding house, and a new boarder arrived in the fall, a young woman named Clara Voss who was studying to become a nurse and who brought an energy and a natural helpfulness to the house that reminded Susanna of herself at that age, all forward motion and organized ambition. The cattle herd grew. Monroe added to it carefully and consistently, and by the time Samuel was 18 months old there were 40 head in the pasture, and Monroe had hired a young cowhand named Pedro Vargas, the younger of the Vargas brothers, who had finished his construction work and wanted to learn cattle, and who turned out to have a genuine affinity for the work. The ranch acquired the quality of establishment that takes time and is not the same as mere possession. The fruit trees grew and flowered and produced their first real harvest in Samuel's second spring. The garden expanded along the south wall. The cattle became a known commodity in the valley market. Monroe was known in Caldera Flats as a man you could do business with, which in that time and place was a more complete recommendation than many titles. Susanna continued the boarding house with Rosa and Clara's help, and it continued to prosper, and she continued to find the management of it satisfying in a way that was hers specifically, that belonged to the particular version of herself that had built something out of nothing in a hard period of her life, and was not inclined to abandon it just because better things had come. 2 years after Samuel's birth, in the spring of 1882, Susanna told Monroe over breakfast that they were going to have another baby. Monroe received this news with the same expression he had received the first news, the complete unguarded joy that she loved specifically, because it was one of the few things that bypassed every reserved and careful layer of him and went straight to what was true. This time, in November, a daughter. She had Susanna's dark hair and Monroe's gray eyes, which was a combination that stopped people in the street when Susanna carried her in town. They named her Margaret, which was Monroe's choice, and Susanna understood what the name meant without being told, understood that he was putting down something he had carried for a long time, honoring it and releasing it in the same gesture, and she thought that was one of the most courageous things she had seen him do. Margaret was a quieter child than Samuel, more observant, watching the world with those gray eyes from her earliest weeks with the specific attentiveness of a person who is taking careful notes. She was devoted to her brother with the earnest particularity of a little sister who has decided that her older sibling is the most interesting thing in her environment, which Samuel found flattering and somewhat overwhelming in equal measure. There was one morning, in the January of 1883, that Monroe would return to many times in the years that followed, that had the quality of a thing that happened once but stayed living. He had been unable to sleep, which was less common than it had once been but still happened, that old restlessness that had driven him out of bed in 100 different rooms over a dozen years, and had once pointed him out the door before the sky lightened. He rose in the dark and stood at the bedroom window and looked at the snow on the fields, the mountains visible against the stars, the garden fence with its cap of white, the stable where the horses breathed warm breath into the cold air. Behind him, Susanna slept in the way she slept, with the absolute completeness of a person who has given everything to the day and is now entirely done with it, one arm extended toward where he had been lying. The room was very quiet. The children slept in the next room, and the house held the particular silence of a full house in the small hours, dense and warm. He stood at the window and felt the old pull, not quite the old desire to move that had defined so many years, but the memory of it, the shape of it, like a scar that has stopped hurting but that you can still find with your fingers. He had been a man who always left before dawn, not because he did not care about the places he stayed, but because leaving before things could matter seemed safer than the alternative. He had left towns and camps and jobs, and once, for 6 years, the ability to care about any of it. He turned from the window and looked at the room, his room, the room he would sleep in tonight and tomorrow night and the night after, the room with the east-facing window that he had first noticed in Susanna's boarding house as the room where a man could watch the sun come up over the mountains if he wanted to, the room with her in it. He got back into bed, and the mattress shifted slightly under his weight, and Susanna turned in her sleep and her hand found his arm in the dark and settled there. Not awake, just finding him with the easy confidence of a person accustomed to finding him there. He lay still and listened to the house breathing and felt the winter outside and the warmth inside and did not move. The sky began to lighten eventually, the way it does even in the middle of January, gradually and without announcement, and he was still there when it did, and still there when Susanna woke and turned and found him lying beside her looking at the ceiling, and she looked at him for a moment. He looked back at her. She did not ask where he was going or why he was still there. She did not say anything at all. She simply looked at him with her dark eyes in the gray morning light, and whatever she saw there seemed to be enough, and she put her head back against his shoulder and they lay together in the January morning, while the sun came up over the mountains, and neither of them said a word, and neither of them needed to. That was the morning he stayed, and it was different from all the mornings before it and all the mornings after it only in the way that a thing that has been wavering finds its balance and holds. He had stayed every morning since he married her, and he would stay every morning going forward. But this morning was the one where he felt it completely, where it landed in him all the way down, that he was not going anywhere, that this was the place, that the long road had been going somewhere after all and he had arrived. Susanna knew this because she could feel it in the quality of his stillness, in the way he breathed, in the particular way he held her that was different from other mornings, more settled, more rooted, as if something that had been trying to stay was finally simply staying. She knew without his saying so and without needing him to, and this was its own kind of intimacy, the kind that lives past words. The years that followed were good years in the full sense, not easy exactly, because ranching in New Mexico territory in the 1880s was not easy work, and the land was not always cooperative, and the weather had its opinions, and the cattle market had its cycles, but good in the way of things that have been built by people who know why they are building them. The ranch grew to 80 head by 1885. Pedro Vargas became a trusted partner in everything but the deed, and Monroe paid him accordingly. Samuel started school in Caldera Flats, riding in with his mother on her boarding house days with the irrepressible sociability of a boy who has grown up in a household full of interesting adults and expects the world to be equally interesting. Margaret followed 2 years later, quieter but no less committed to the enterprise of learning, and she took to arithmetic with a focus that made her teacher, the replacement who had come after Della, write to Susanna that she had never taught a child so methodical. Clarence Webb retired from the land office in 1886 at 68 and moved to Santa Fe to live with his daughter's family, and his departure from the boarding house left a genuine absence that Susanna marked by putting a new lamp in his old room and keeping it lit in the evenings as if for company. She and Monroe made the journey to visit him in Santa Fe once a year, and he called them his family, which is what they were. Della and James had 2 children, a boy and a girl, and lived above the general store with the comfortable abundance of people who have built the right life. And Susanna and Monroe and their children ate Sunday dinner at the Aldridges approximately once a month, 4 adults and 4 children around a crowded table, which was loud and cheerful, and the kind of occasion that leaves you fuller than you arrived. By the late 1880s, the territory was changing, the railroad coming closer, and the population growing, and the wild and unfinished quality of the land giving way gradually to something more settled. And this was not without its losses. The particular kind of sky and silence that had defined the West of the 1870s belonging increasingly to memory. But there were compensations. Among them, a territorial court system that was becoming more reliable, and a land law that was becoming more navigable, both of which meant that the kind of thing Garland Prout had attempted was harder to accomplish, though men like Prout did not stop trying. Prout himself had moved his operation south after the Santa Fe ruling, and Susanna had heard through the legal grapevine of other challenges and other rulings, some going his way and some not, and she did not think much about him except occasionally when she stood at the garden fence and watched the creek run the way it had always run and thought about the version of this story where she had done nothing, where the water had been diverted and she had lost the garden and had to dig a well she could not afford. And she was glad each time to return to the version that had actually happened, with Whitfield's letter and Monroe's quiet certainty, and the judge in Santa Fe ruling in her favor. One evening in the summer of 1889, Monroe and Susanna sat on the porch of the ranch house after the children had been put to bed, the way they sat most evenings when the weather allowed, in the two chairs that faced west toward the darkening mountains. The fireflies were out in the field, and the air smelled of the summer grass and the distant rain that was still in the mountains and would arrive by morning. 11 years, Susanna said. Since you knocked on my door, she said. Monroe looked out at the mountains. 11 years, he said. What do you think about that? She asked. He was quiet for a moment in the good way he was quiet, the thinking way rather than the avoiding way. I think about who I was, he said. When I came off that road, I was so careful about everything, careful not to need anything too much. I had convinced myself that it was wisdom. And now I think it was the saddest kind of fear dressed up as sense, he said. And I am grateful every single day that you were too direct to let me keep doing it. She looked at him sideways. I was not that direct. You were, he said, from the day you opened the door. You looked at me, and I could tell you were deciding whether I was honest, not whether I was impressive or convenient or suitable in some social sense, but whether I was honest. And I thought if I could be honest with you, that was worth staying for. Susanna set her hand on the arm of his chair and he covered it with his own. You stayed, she said. I stayed, he said. The fireflies moved in the field below them, and the mountains held the last of the light on their peaks, and the house behind them held their children sleeping, and the ranch held the cattle breathing in the summer dark, and Monroe Shelby held his wife's hand on the porch they had built together in the territory they had made their own, and it was so completely and thoroughly enough that it required nothing else. Samuel grew to be a young man with his father's steady temperament and his mother's practicality, and by the time he was 16, he was working the ranch with the easy competence of someone who has grown up watching work done right. He had an affinity for the cattle that Monroe recognized as something you either have or you don't, and he had it completely. Margaret studied with a seriousness that led her, in 1902, when the territory had changed considerably from the raw and unfinished place of her parents' early years, to pursue nursing formally, the profession that Clara Voss had been studying when she boarded at Susanna's house 20 years before, which Susanna found to be one of the more satisfying continuities of her long life. The boarding house was still running in 1895, with Rosa Estrada managing the kitchen almost entirely by that point, and Susanna overseeing with the practiced ease of a woman who has run something well for long enough to know exactly what it needs. It had hosted dozens of boarders over the years, young men heading to the mines, families passing through, school teachers and clerks, and a doctor who stayed 6 months while deciding whether to settle, and each of them had left something in the atmosphere of the place, the way people leave something in places where they are well looked after. The ranch was 240 acres by 1895, and Monroe was 50 years old, and he worked it with the energy of a man 15 years younger, because he had found, late but completely, the particular fuel that comes from being in exactly the right place. The lines around his eyes had deepened, and his hair had silvered at the temples in a way Susanna found distinguished and occasionally said so, which made him look at her with the expression he had had the night she said yes in the Santa Fe Plaza, slightly disbelieving and thoroughly pleased. They argued sometimes, as people who live and work closely together will argue, about land management and money, and the proper way to handle a specific problem with the cattle or the boarding house or the children's education. And these arguments were direct and occasionally heated and always resolved, because they were both fundamentally reasonable people who respected each other's intelligence and were committed to the same things. After an argument, Monroe had the habit of bringing her coffee before she had asked for it, which was not precisely an apology but was its own language, and Susanna understood it. On an evening in 1898, 20 years after Monroe had first arrived in Caldera Flats, they rode out together to the high meadow above the ranch, just the two of them, on a September afternoon when the aspens were turning gold and the air had the first edge of autumn cold in it. They had ridden to this meadow dozens of times over the years. It was one of Monroe's survey routes from those original working weeks when he had still technically been surveying for the Colorado rancher, and it retained for both of them a quality of early connection, of the time when everything was still becoming. They sat on the grass in the September afternoon and looked down at the valley where the town was visible in the distance and the ranch was visible closer, the house and barn and the cattle as small as models from this height, the whole thing arranged below them like evidence of something. "We built something," Susanna said. "We did," Monroe said. "I had not expected to," she said. "After Thomas, I had expected to manage, to keep things going. I had not expected to build." He looked at her with those eyes that she knew so well now, that she had watched change with every light and every mood for 20 years, and he said, "You would have built something regardless. You are not the kind of person who only manages. I needed you for the parts I could not see," she said, "and you needed me to stop moving," he said, "so we were useful to each other from the beginning." "We were more than useful," she said. "Yes," he said, "we were." She leaned against him in the September meadow, and the aspens shook their gold leaves in the afternoon wind and the valley lay below them. Their valley, their town, their house, their life. And it was more than she had planned for and exactly what she had needed, and she would not have changed a single morning of it. They rode back down as the sun was setting, the way they had always been better at returning than leaving, and the house was lit and warm, and the smell of Rose's supper came out to meet them before they reached the gate, and Monroe held the gate for her horse, and she rode through, and he followed, and they unsaddled together in the stable the way they had done 10,000 times, and went inside to their family and their life, and the long and luminous ordinary evening of people who have found the place they were meant to be and stayed there together, through every season. There was one final story that Susanna always told when people asked her about her life, about how it had come to be the way it was, about Monroe and the ranch and the children and the boarding house and all of it. She told it the same way every time, not because she could not elaborate, but because the essential thing was simple enough that it did not need elaboration. She said, "A man came to my door one October evening with dust on his coat and the kind of tired in his eyes that comes from a long time of moving, and I gave him a room, and he stayed 3 days and then another week, and then through the winter, and then forever. And I do not know that I have ever been sure whether I saved him or he saved me, but I know that we were both better for having stopped at the same time in the same place, and that is the only miracle I have ever needed." Monroe Shelby, who was usually in the room when she told this story, and who typically looked at the floor with the particular expression of a man who finds certain kinds of truth simultaneously accurate and overwhelming, always added exactly one thing when she finished. He said, "The morning I stayed was the morning I understood that a life is not the distance you cover. It is the thing you tend. And then the subject would change and supper would happen, and the children would be loud, and the evening would go the way evenings go in households where love has had enough time to become ordinary in the best possible sense, which is to say, constant, unremarkable, completely essential, and not for a single day taken for granted.